Do people with healthy relationships late in life, and we were talking before about the importance of young people building real deep connections. I'm interested, do people that do have these healthy, strong relationships later in life, do they tend to have this sorted in their 20s and 30s? And if they don't, then it's kind of like you reach a point where it's too late?
Yeah. So that's a great question. One I kind of feel pretty passionately about. When you study people over 85 years of their life, one of the clearest things you learn is that people change. So there are two kinds of changes. Some are normative changes that happen developmentally, like, we learn more words as we grow older as a kid. That's a developmental thing that our language improves over time. So one of the things we've learned now from our study and from other studies is that older people do get wiser in a certain way, that they grow emotionally. They learn how to maximize the emotional benefits of relationships. This is normative. So in general, they learn to maximize those benefits. And part of that pruning, their social networks are often smaller. People die, they lose touch with folks. They're more circumscribed in their movements as well, their ability to get around. So their social networks may shrink, but their relationships tend to be more rewarding with those fewer number of people. So normatively, the good news is we tend to learn things as we grow old. We think about that as wisdom. And there is, in fact, we can study that and see that there is wisdom as we grow old. Then there are individual changes. So there are people in our study who were miserable and lonely for most of their adult life. There's someone who we highlight in a later chapter that, in fact, we call It's Never Too Late is the name of the chapter. And this person lived an incredibly lonely existence. He was a watchmaker. He got most of his joy out of working with watches and repairing them. In a marriage that wasn't very satisfying, his wife wasn't very social. They rarely got out of the house and spent time with other people. His work was his main source of satisfaction. In his 60s, his eyesight started to go. It got more difficult to do the work with his hands as well. And he had to retire. He made two very brave decisions at that point. He decided to separate from his wife, who he had been in an unhappy relationship with for almost 40 years. And he decided he was getting old enough, it was time to go to a gym to work on his physical health. He went to a gym the same time every day, and he realized that the same people go to the gym at the same time he goes every day. And over time, repeated encounters with people, he started making connections with people, including people who are interested in old movies, which was his other favorite thing in life. And he started inviting people from the gym, these were younger people, over to his house to watch old movies together. So this was a guy who in his 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, we'd ask the question, do you have friends? He would say very simply, no. In his 70s, after he had spent time at the gym and had grown, do you have friends? With a little bit of a smile, yes, several. So this is an incredible story. And again, it's one of those transition points, right? It was retirement. And for him, it was separating from his wife at the same time. Somewhat serendipitously, because he began to work on his physical health, his social fitness improved. He was there with people every day, engaging, got out of his house, right, as the moral of the story. He was active with other people, and suddenly his friendship network changed. Now, he never had lots and lots of friends, but having several friends for a period of time late in his life, after having no friends at all for 40 or 50 years and feeling quite alone, quite an achievement. So the answer is, yes, we all change in a normative way. Some of those changes are good. All of us learn some wisdom across time, even though we vary in how good we are at connecting with others. But some people take advantage of, particularly of transitions in their life or periods of time when it's not working for them, and they learn and grow in important ways. And it's very clear from our research that that's true. That's in contrast, Simon, to psychology. If you read psychology texts 30, 40 years ago, there was a lot of information about how children change. And there was a suggestion that by age 18, we were kind of set in stone. Our personalities were set. Our brains didn't change very much after that. We know that that's not true. Our brains continue to change. They're plastic throughout our lifetime. And they change in predictable ways and unusual ways when we engage in certain activities. And the same is true for our social connections as well.
I love that story of that man. Very, very heartwarming.
It's incredible. Incredible. Yeah.
Is this relationship that we're talking about between relationships happiness and longevity. Is it the same for men and women?
Yeah. So I think, yes. There's some evidence that at one time in kind of recent history, men were happier than women, and then it became sort of roughly equal. There's some suggestion it's continuing to change. But if there's a difference in happiness that's connected with gender, it's very, very small. They're essentially equivalent. I think the more challenging question is, are there differences in the way men and women navigate social connections? That's a really interesting question. And I would say historically, it was very true that there were some differences in how men and women navigate social connections. So women had more friends. They often had more intimate connections with others. They often organized for couples the social experiences of both members of that couple, so that labor fell unequally towards women. They had more responsibility for it. But it's pretty clear when you look developmentally, if you look at adolescents these days, boys and girls, and you ask them about what they're looking for in friendships, it's remarkably similar. Boys and girls both want friends that are interested in who they are, that will look out for them, that have their back. But really, there's a kind of sense of trust and the ability to share intimate experiences with that other person, meaning important experiences in their own life with that other person. Something seems to happen still in most societies for boys and young men where that becomes mixed up. That sense of intimacy becomes mixed up with masculinity, that somehow being masculine shouldn't be about sharing or that intimacy, and they pull back in certain ways from that. And I think that still goes on, but it's changing at an incredibly rapid pace. Again, I work with young people all the time, and this whole notion of what we mean by gender has changed in important ways, and the expectations for what might be put on masculinity or femininity are changing quite rapidly. So that's a long way of saying objectively, we don't see a lot of differences these days, not as many as we used to see between men and women in their connection with other people, the importance of friendships, the number of friends that we have. That's gotten very small if there are any differences. And it's clear that for both men and women, these connections are important. What may be different is the role that the primary relationship plays. For men, it may be more important to their health than for women. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there's some research to support this. If your spouse dies, particularly if it's the man is widowed and loses his wife, his risk of dying in the next year is quite high compared to prior to that death. For women, the risk is lower than it is for men. There's some research that suggests that. So the things that men have traditionally gotten out of close relationships, they may benefit them more than in traditional circumstances they benefited women. There are changes that are going on now that I think mean that we need to re-examine that. Partnerships have changed in important ways, but traditionally we saw more benefits for men from their primary relationship than for women.
So when the husband passes away, what you're saying there is the life expectancy of the wife who's still alive actually increases? And what if so?
It doesn't increase. No,
doesn't increase.
No, it's just not as greatly. The risk of dying in that next year is lower for women than it is for men after losing a partner. There's still a heightened risk. So there's still an incredible adjustment and stress, and grief is really hard. But some have interpreted the difference as a sign that men were getting more out of this partnership than the women were getting out of. Women were paying more, if you will, and getting less out of it. I think that partnership is changing in important ways, so we need to continue to study this, but that's been the traditional signs about the different role of relationships for men and women.
That makes more sense than what I said. If someone earlier heard us say that loneliness kills, and they're thinking, I enjoy time by myself, I like solitude. What's the distinction between spending time in solitude, spending time by yourself, and feeling lonely?
So loneliness is not about physical isolation, right? Some people live in places where they're very remote and in rural areas where there may not be another house around for miles. That's physical isolation. Older people tend to be more physically isolated because perhaps they're not able to drive or they're not as mobile as they were when they were younger, so it's harder for them to get together with other people. So that's physical isolation. When we talk about loneliness, we're talking about an internal experience. We're talking about a subjective sense that our relationships and our connections aren't where we'd like them to be. It's kind of like people have used the metaphor of thirst or hunger. It's we want more from our connections with others. And most of what we want is we want to be known by others. We want to know that someone at least has our back and that someone's looking out for us and cares about whether we're doing okay or not. So that's the feeling, the experience, the set of that perception of the world around you. That's what's particularly corrosive and is tied to lots of diseases of aging and premature death. That sense that there's no one out there that really knows us or cares about us, and that we want more somehow. And that's a feeling that, unfortunately, Simon, this is true across developed countries, is common, right? In the United States, depends on the survey, somewhere between 20 and 50% of folks over the age of 18 report experiencing loneliness in a given week. It's a common feeling.
You mentioned earlier there are many different types of good quality relationships. It could be intimate. It could be with your children. It could be with a friend. What about the relationship that we have with ourselves? And I have to imagine, as a clinical psychologist, this is something that you work with people on. Do you have to have a healthy relationship with yourself before you can go out and form healthy relationships with others?
Yeah, people say that a lot, and I think it's partially true and partially false. So let me say why I mean that. None of us are perfect. We're all evolving. We're works in progress, all of us. And even those wise elders that in their 80s and 90s have really figured out how to get the most out of their connections with others, they're works in progress as well. So to wait until you've worked out your relationship with yourself, worked out your stuff, means that you're going to miss out on life, right? Life continues to happen, and life is short. So we need to recognize that we're all flawed in some ways. Even those of us that have the most confidence in ourselves and think that we're the most competent, there are ways that we can grow. So I never want people to get the message that we need to fix ourselves first before we can engage in connections with others, because that's going to be a lonely and difficult life. The other piece that complements what I've just said, which is really important, is that we often grow not just by being by ourselves and figuring stuff out in our house, in our heads, or even with a therapist, right? With a therapist, it's interesting to think about. You're in relationship with someone who's trying to help you. An important part of a therapeutic relationship is the presence of that connection between the client and the therapist. So we flourish and grow and learn things when we're in connection with others. My wife has taught me so many things that I never would have learned if I wasn't in a relationship with her. Part of it is around the differences that we've had, or things that I've had to adjust or think about or re-examine that I assume were true, but were only true because of the world I happened to grow up in or the family that I happened to grow up in. And when I look closely at another person's life through her lens, I recognize that there are other ways of looking at things. So we grow in relationship. So yes, we need to work on the things that make us, that create challenges for us in life. Some of us need to heal from past relationships that have been difficult, but we need to figure out ways to continue to engage with others, because relationships themselves have the capacity to continue to enrich our lives and to help us grow. Now, I haven't said this, but it's very clear from all the questions and the ways we both have talked about it. Relationships, there's no guarantee of health. They're challenging. They're not easy to control. Our partner, whether it's a friend or an intimate relationship, changes and grows and has their own ideas about things. Relationships can be quite challenging as well. So I'm not suggesting that being in a relationship with others is always about ease. It's not always about joy. And in fact, if we think about it, this is the irony of life. This is the sort of, it's not an optimistic view. If we don't connect with others, it's hard to flourish. If we do connect with others, we experience the most intense feeling of all, which is loss and grief, when we have those deep connections with others. So this is the irony or the conundrum of living, that we have to engage in these relationships that make us vulnerable. They leave us feeling the greatest feelings of sadness and loss when we lose people people that we're connected to. But if we don't do that, it's awfully hard to experience the incredible joys and pleasures of life as well.
Kind of forces us to experience that, the full spectrum of emotions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the, so Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's popularized Zen or Buddhist ideas really about mindfulness for public audiences. The book that I think was most popular is a book he called Full Catastrophe Living. And that's a line from the movie Zorba the Greek. Zorba the Greek is someone that leans into life fully and experiences all of it. And there's a particular scene where he's on a boat and he's talking to someone who's much more reserved about how you have to lean into the full catastrophe. Kids, marriage, challenges. That's the catastrophe of life, but it's also the beauty of life. That's where that title comes from.